"Sir, I'm here to deliver a final eviction notice. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises." That's what the clipboard-wielding HOA representative said as he stood on my porch like he owned the place, completely ignoring the massive plaque mounted right behind him that read, "McAllister Homestead, established 1862. The man was so focused on his little power trip, he didn't even realize he was trying to evict a McAllister from McAllister land in McAllister Township. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was war. I'd been living peacefully on the land my family had cultivated for generations, a stretch of property older than asphalt and zip code. My farmhouse had survived 2 world wars, 3 tornadoes, and 1 very drunk uncle driving a tractor through the kitchen. But apparently, it wouldn't survive the wrath of Karen Montgomery and her freshly manicured tyranny at the Homeowners Association. I knew her type the moment she introduced herself at a neighborhood meet and greet last year. She brought gluten-free muffins, a 7-page list of infractions she noticed just driving by, and the smugness of someone who once watched a courtroom drama and thought they could practice law. So when the letter came, delivered in an overly decorative envelope with gold embossing, I laughed. I genuinely laughed. Until I flipped the page and saw the threat in all caps. Failure to vacate will result in legal proceedings and forced removal. The HOA claimed I'd violated 17 different community regulations. My mailbox was non-conforming. My front porch light was not HOA approved. My barn, which had been here longer than the zip code, was labeled an illegal structure. Oh, and my chickens, my grandfather's prized heritage hens, were referred to as unsanctioned livestock. They weren't chickens anymore, they were code violations with feathers. I walked into my study, pulled down the top drawer of my grandfather's oak desk, and retrieved the deed. The original one. Hand-signed, ink-smudged, yellowed with age, and sealed with a wax stamp. It clearly outlined that our land was exempt from any future residential covenants due to its historical and sovereign designation. In layman's terms, untouchable. But apparently the HOA missed that little detail. I decided to pay Karen a visit, partly to clarify things, but mostly to enjoy the look on her face when I handed her a legal document older than the concept of suburbs. She lived in the gated portion of the neighborhood. Of course she did. Her house was a monstrosity of beige stucco, perfectly trimmed hedges, and overpriced lawn art. When she opened the door, she was wearing tennis whites and sipping something green from a mason jar. I told her about the mistake. She smiled. The kind of smile that makes you want to check your wallet. Then she said, "Oh, I'm well aware of your little land claim, but we've decided to extend the HOA boundaries to maintain community cohesion. And you are not cohesive." That's when it hit me. This wasn't about code violations or chickens or porch lights. This was personal. Karen didn't like that my land didn't fall under her control. She didn't like that I didn't attend the HOA barbecues, that I refused to pay her voluntary landscaping contributions, or that I didn't cower when she sent her patrol volunteers to take photos of my suspicious shed, which, by the way, was my great-grandfather's blacksmith shop. The next morning, 2 things happened. First, I got a certified letter with a countdown clock printed in red ink. 72 hours. And second, I found a measuring tape stretched across my driveway with flags marking encroaching structures. It was on. Karen had declared war. She may have had bylaws and a board vote, but I had ancestry, public records, and something far more dangerous, time and a really dark sense of humor. That evening, I dug through family archives, called the town historian, and even reached out to the county assessor. I was building a file. And the more I dug, the more I realized Karen had built her entire HOA empire on a foundation of shaky assumptions. For starters, her HOA wasn't technically authorized to expand into my land without a unanimous vote from every property owner, and since I owned a good third of the area they'd tried to annex, her vote was invalid. Second, her own property had a legal hiccup. She'd installed a decorative fountain 2 feet over the permitted boundary line onto township property. But I didn't play my cards just yet. Instead, I gave her exactly what she wanted: silence. For 3 days, I let her believe she'd won. She strutted past my house, clipboard in hand, muttering fake legalese to her minions. She sent another notice, this one attached to my gate with bright pink tape. I removed it with barbecue tongs and tossed it into the fire pit. When the 72 hours expired, Karen and her crew rolled up in matching polos, clipboards in tow, and tried to look official. Chad, her nephew who was apparently their legal counsel, wore aviators and read off a printout from some shady website. "You are in violation of Municipal Code 4-16B, he said, squinting like a discount Tom Cruise. "We are authorized to begin the process of peaceful removal." I handed him the original land deed and a copy of the town's founding charter. He blinked, confused. Karen snatched it from him, read the first paragraph, and her jaw tightened. The look on her face was better than any Netflix finale I've ever watched. That's when the town sheriff pulled up, sirens off but lights flashing. He stepped out, nodded at me, then turned to Karen. "Ma'am, we've had a report of harassment and trespassing. This land is not under HOA jurisdiction." Karen sputtered, tried to protest, then pointed at her clipboard like it was the Constitution. The sheriff simply said, "Ma'am, this deed's older than your entire neighborhood. You might want to leave before you make things worse." And that, right there, was the moment the battle lines were officially drawn. Karen wasn't going to give up. Not because she had a legal leg to stand on, she didn't, but because she couldn't handle not having the last word. But what she didn't know was that I wasn't just going to win. I was going to make her regret every signature, every threat, every clipboard stroke of petty tyranny she'd ever made. She wanted a war. I was about to give her one for the history books. And the best part? I'd already won before she even knew the first shot had been fired. The funny thing about Karen is that she didn't take the sheriff's warning as a defeat. No, in her mind, it was just a temporary misunderstanding that she could fix with the right combination of legal-sounding jargon and aggressive passive aggression. The very next morning, I found a new letter shoved through the slats of my fence. No envelope this time, just folded paper with red marker all over it like a kindergartner's failed art project. It was labeled Second and Final Notice. Apparently, Karen believed that if she added more words in capital letters and increased the font size, the law would suddenly bend in her favor. She now claimed that I was in violation of what she referred to as Zone 7 residential uniformity clauses, which, according to her, required that all homes within view of the main road maintain aesthetic consistency. My front porch, with its antique swing and mismatched flower pots, was apparently a visual disruption. My barn, which had been there before any of these houses even existed, was now an unapproved external structure. She even took issue with my dog's collar color. Not joking. Said it clashed with the HOA's seasonal theme. I couldn't stop laughing. It was so ridiculous it bordered on performance art. But that laughter didn't last long because the next move Karen made wasn't just annoying, it was malicious. I was walking to my mailbox when I noticed the utility flags, bright orange and yellow, planted all across my driveway and along the fence line. I followed them to the edge of the road where a contractor's truck was parked. I asked the guy what was going on. He said he'd been hired by the HOA to pre-inspect the area for drainage adjustments. Apparently, Karen had submitted a request to the county claiming my land was responsible for runoff issues in the neighborhood. He shrugged and said he was just doing what he was told. I walked back inside, already dialing the county inspector's office. After explaining the situation and sending them a copy of the deed, they confirmed that not only was my property exempt from any such HOA-driven inspection, but also that the contractor had no right to be there in the first place. I faxed over everything. 2 hours later, the same contractor returned, not to dig, but to apologize. He looked genuinely annoyed that he'd been misled and said, "This Karen lady said it was HOA mandated. Should have known she was full of it. That should have been the end of it," but Karen wasn't done. She doubled down. Within days, I started receiving citations. Not legal ones, fake ones. Printed forms with HOA logos and fine amounts ranging from $50 to $500 for absurd things like overgrown vegetation on fence posts and unauthorized flag display. That one really ticked me off. My grandfather's military flag hung over the front porch, folded properly, displayed respectfully, and protected under federal law. I called the HOA's general line and got voicemail. I tried emailing. Nothing. So I decided to show up to the next HOA meeting. It was held at the clubhouse on Elmwood Drive, a building that looked like a retired yogurt shop trying to be fancy. I arrived early, documents in hand, and took a seat in the back row. As the room filled up with homeowners, I noticed something interesting. People were murmuring, whispering, eyeing me, but not in a hostile way. Curious. Some nodded. A few even smiled. Apparently, word had gotten around about Karen's crusade against the guy who owned half the county. One guy leaned over and whispered, "You're the McAllister guy, right? Heard you made her cry last week." I hadn't, but I didn't bother correcting him. When Karen took the front of the room, she wore a blazer like she was about to announce a Supreme Court ruling. She tapped the mic like she'd been waiting for this moment all her life. "As president of the HOA," she began, "I must remind everyone that compliance is not optional. We must hold all residents to the same standard." She glanced in my direction without directly addressing me. Then she proceeded to rattle off a list of proposed amendments to the bylaws, all of which clearly targeted me: new restrictions on non-uniform paint colors, stricter noise regulations during tractor usage, and even a proposed limitation on historical flags not directly tied to national holidays. I nearly choked on my complimentary seltzer. When she finished her sanctimonious speech, I raised my hand. She hesitated. I could see the gears turning. She didn't want to give me the floor, but she also didn't want to look like she was afraid of me in front of a crowd. So she called on me with forced politeness. I stood, turned to the group, and introduced myself. Evan McAllister. My family founded this town. Literally. My great-great-grandfather signed the township charter in 1862. The land I live on was part of the original plot, and I have the deed to prove it. I held it up. Murmurs rippled across the room. I continued, "Now I understand the value of community standards, but what I don't understand is why the HOA thinks it has authority over property that predates the HOA, the clubhouse, and half your homes. What's more interesting is that Karen here has been issuing fines that aren't legally enforceable, hiring contractors without permits, and expanding HOA jurisdiction without a proper vote." I stepped aside as the town historian, Mr. Thompson, came up behind me holding a folder thicker than a steak menu. He'd volunteered to speak once he heard about the nonsense. He laid out the documents: the original town map, the exemption clause in the charter, and a timeline proving my property had never once been under HOA oversight. Karen's face went pale. Her lips tightened into a thin, miserable line. Chad, her nephew, stood up like he was going to object, but then quickly sat back down when Mr. Thompson handed him a photocopy of the founding documents. Chad looked like a kid who'd just been handed a calculus test in crayon. And then came the best part. Someone in the audience raised their hand and asked, "So, does this mean we can't enforce anything on his land?" Mr. Thompson answered with a definitive correct. Another homeowner asked, "Then why has the HOA been spending money on legal letters and boundary surveys?" The room turned. Karen shuffled her papers. Her voice cracked as she tried to pivot the conversation. "Let's move to the next agenda item." But the room didn't move with her. People started whispering again, only now it was louder. Annoyed. Suspicious. A woman in the second row stood and asked if the HOA could provide a full financial report. Another homeowner asked why his backyard fire pit was removed last year, but Evan's tractor was suddenly a national monument. The crowd was slipping away from her like sand through fingers. Her control, her illusion of power, was fading. I didn't stay for the rest of the meeting. I figured I'd made my point. As I walked out, a few folks clapped. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just enough to know I wasn't alone anymore. Karen may have walked into that room with her head held high, but she walked out looking like she'd aged 10 years. And I knew then that she wasn't going to back down quietly. She was going to come at me harder than before. What she didn't realize was that the more she tried, the deeper the hole she'd dig. And I had the shovel ready. You'd think after being publicly embarrassed, exposed for overstepping her authority, and challenged by the literal founding family of the town, Karen would cool down. Maybe take a break from HOA tyranny and reflect. Maybe learn a lesson. But no. Karen Montgomery was not the type to walk away. She was the type to double down, dig her heels in, and throw everything at the wall hoping something would stick. She didn't just want control, she wanted revenge. And she didn't care how petty she had to get it. It started with the trash. One morning, I walked out to the edge of my property and found 3 large, leaking bags of garbage dumped in my ditch. Banana peels, empty wine bottles, and something that may have once been lasagna but now looked like an abstract art piece titled Fungal Nightmare. At first, I figured it was random dumping. Happens sometimes when you live on a big stretch of land. But the second time it happened, same ditch, same style of bags, and strangely, a HOA-branded newsletter tucked between some egg cartons. I knew it wasn't random. Karen was trying to get the county sanitation department involved, probably hoping to have my property flagged as unsanitary. A sneaky tactic. But the best part? I had cameras. I hadn't always had them. But after the first eviction stunt, I installed a discreet set of motion-activated trail cams, the kind hunters use to monitor deer. They were tucked into fence posts, hidden under the eaves of the barn, and positioned perfectly. I checked the footage and, like clockwork, there it was. A silver SUV creeping along the property line at 2:42 a.m., trunk pops open, and a woman in fuzzy slippers and a hoodie chucks 3 trash bags out like she's feeding raccoons. The kicker? The license plate was perfectly clear. I printed a few stills, packaged them up with a smiley face sticker, and sent it to the county's environmental enforcement office. 3 days later, I got a message that not only would the dumping be investigated, but also that someone had filed a counter-complaint alleging I had contaminated soil. When the officer came to inspect, he stepped 1 boot onto my land, looked around, then chuckled. "This is the cleanest property I've seen this month." She's out of her mind. Karen didn't stop. Next came the fire hazard complaint. I got a certified letter from the HOA stating that my old wooden structures, specifically the barn and the tool shed, posed a fire threat to the neighborhood and would need to be torn down or retrofitted with modern flame-retardant siding. The absurdity of that nearly gave me whiplash. My barn wasn't some dry, rotting shack. It had been updated 2 years ago with treated lumber and a sprinkler system, courtesy of my cousin who just so happened to be the local fire marshal. I called him up, sent him the letter, and he laughed so hard he snorted. Then he offered to come over and do an official fire safety inspection. We walked the property together, and he filled out a full report. Everything passed. In fact, it passed so well he said it could be used as a training example. I forwarded the report to the HOA and requested that any further communications on this matter be routed through my attorney. Karen didn't reply directly, but that didn't mean she was done. No, her next move was the most ridiculous yet. I came home one day to find a brand new, waist-high fence going up, right across the entrance to my main driveway. 2 guys in fluorescent vests were hammering in posts like they were building the Berlin Wall. I stopped the truck, got out, and asked them what in God's name they thought they were doing. One of them shrugged and said they were just following orders. The HOA had issued a community directive to build a decorative privacy barrier along the road for aesthetic consistency. The barrier, of course, just so happened to block my driveway and only mine. Not the neighbors. Not the house across the street. Just me. I told them they had 60 seconds to stop and leave before I brought out my backhoe. They didn't take me seriously. So I walked to the barn, fired up the backhoe, and drove it down the gravel like a man on a mission. The moment they saw it coming, they panicked. One ran to the truck. The other just dropped his hammer and sprinted. I didn't hit the fence yet. I stopped short, got off, and took pictures of the half-installed post. Then I ripped out the permit sign they had tacked into the ground and called the county. Not only was there no permit, but the HOA had filed the request using altered maps that falsely showed the land as shared jurisdiction. The fence came down that night. I sent the bill for fence removal and driveway obstruction to the HOA with a little note. Next time, try crayons. They're more your speed. I didn't expect a response. I didn't need one, because by then, something amazing had started happening. People were noticing. Other homeowners started talking. They realized Karen had been using the HOA funds for all these antics, unauthorized legal letters, private contractors, and who knows what else. A few reached out privately and told me they'd been fined for things like faded mailbox paint and unapproved Halloween decorations. I encouraged them to ask questions. So they did. And when they got brushed off or stonewalled, I handed them my stack of evidence. Within a week, a small rebellion was brewing. A homeowner named Brenda, who used to be Karen's best friend until they disagreed over patio umbrellas, requested a financial audit. Another guy named Carl started circulating a petition to limit the president's authority. I didn't lead the charge, I didn't need to. Karen had created her own army of enemies. Just when I thought she couldn't get more desperate, she made one final mistake. She tried to hold an emergency vote to remove my property's exemption status. A vote to override a legal deed. I don't know if it was ignorance or desperation, but either way, it was laughable. She hosted the meeting in the clubhouse, locked the doors, and only invited people she thought would vote her way. Someone recorded the whole thing. When the footage hit the neighborhood group chat, it spread like wildfire. People were furious. That was the last straw. Calls were made. Complaints were filed. A quiet investigation had already been brewing behind the scenes thanks to the trail I'd left. The fake fines, the fraudulent fence, the false reports, and now, potential embezzlement. The state housing authority was getting involved. Karen had started this thinking she could bully a man off his land. That she could intimidate, manipulate, and steamroll her way through with printed letters and power play. But now, she was backed into a corner. And the worst part for her? I hadn't even gone full offensive yet. I'd just been defending myself. The real show was about to begin. And it was going to make every single one of her stunts look like a warm-up act. The letter arrived on a Thursday, just as I was finishing repairs on the old well pump. It was delivered not by mail, but by a courier wearing a cheap suit and even cheaper cologne. He looked uncomfortable just standing on my porch, like the air itself knew he didn't belong. He handed me a manila envelope, nodded without a word, and walked briskly back to his Prius. Inside was a formal summons. Karen and the HOA were taking me to court. According to the document, I was being sued for noncompliance, community disruption, and refusal to abide by updated boundary ordinances. I laughed so hard I had to sit down on the porch swing. Karen wasn't just grasping at straws now, she was building an entire haystack of nonsense. The so-called ordinance she was referencing didn't exist in any public record. The compliance issue had already been addressed by the town historian and confirmed by the sheriff. And community disruption? That was just code for making her look bad. But even though the claims were absurd, I knew better than to dismiss a legal summons. I'd seen enough courtroom drama to know it wasn't about who was right, it was about who had proof. Luckily, I had plenty. The date was set for the following Tuesday in the county courthouse. It wasn't some grand, mahogany-paneled courtroom from the movies. More like beige walls, buzzing lights, and chairs that squeaked if you even thought about shifting your weight. But I wasn't going for the ambience. I was going to end this war once and for all. I arrived early with a briefcase stuffed with documents. The original land deed, the exemption clause from the founding charter, a notarized letter from the county assessor, photographs of the fence, security footage of the trash dumping, the fire marshal's inspection report, and a signed statement from the contractor Karen hired to trespass on my land. My lawyer, Denise, was already there waiting. She was a local legend, the kind of woman who could dismantle an argument with nothing but a raised eyebrow and a legal citation. Karen showed up 10 minutes late with a whole entourage. Chad was there, wearing a suit 2 sizes too big and sunglasses indoors again. She had a second man with her too, some out-of-town attorney with slicked-back hair and the smug look of someone who didn't realize he was about to lose spectacularly. Karen herself wore a red pantsuit that looked like it had been ironed by rage. When the judge walked in, everyone stood, and then the real show began. Karen's lawyer opened with a dramatic speech about neighborhood harmony, collective responsibility, and the duty of all residents to submit to community governance. He gestured like he was auditioning for a stage play. Then he laid out his case, how my land visually disrupted the neighborhood, how I refused to comply with community standards, and how unchecked noncompliance threatened the cohesion of the HOA. He even tried to claim that my tractor violated a noise ordinance because it startled a poodle. I don't even own a tractor with a working engine right now. Then it was our turn. Denise stood calmly, adjusted her glasses, and said, "Let's start with the land deed." She handed it to the judge, along with the town charter. "You'll see that not only does Mr. McAllister's property predate the HOA, but it's legally exempt from all future residential covenant restrictions." The judge read it, nodded. Denise didn't stop there. She presented the fire marshal's report, the sanitation officer's letter clearing me of any dumping violations, and the footage of Karen herself tossing trash onto my land. The courtroom was silent except for the click of the projector and the occasional gasp from the audience. Then Denise dropped the hammer. "We also have reason to believe the HOA has misappropriated community funds to pursue this baseless lawsuit, including payments made to unlicensed contractors and legal filings under fraudulent zoning maps." She handed over the receipts, the altered survey documents, and a breakdown from a licensed surveyor showing how Karen had fabricated jurisdiction over my property. Karen started whispering frantically to Chad, who looked like he was considering tunneling out through the floor. The judge leaned forward, steepled his fingers, and asked a simple question. "Mrs. Montgomery, are you aware that your HOA has no legal authority over Mr. McAllister's property?" Karen stood, stammering, insisting that visual cohesion justified an extension of HOA boundaries. The judge interrupted her. "Visual cohesion is not a legal doctrine. You are not city council. You are a homeowners association. Your reach ends at your charter, and your charter ends well before Mr. McAllister's driveway." Karen's face turned several shades of red. Her lawyer tried to pivot, asking for a continuance to re-examine the historical record, but the judge had heard enough. Case dismissed. All claims void. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the State Housing Authority for investigation into potential misconduct. The courtroom buzzed with quiet excitement. Even the bailiff cracked a smile. Outside, reporters were already waiting. Apparently, word had spread. Small-town drama mixed with legal fireworks is always good for ratings. I didn't say much, just nodded, smiled, and held up the old deed like it was Excalibur. Karen, meanwhile, ducked behind Chad as if his law school dropout aura would protect her from public scrutiny. It didn't. The fallout came quickly. Within days, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. Not to discipline Karen, but to investigate her. Homeowners wanted answers. Where had the money gone? Who authorized the lawsuits? Why were they paying fines for mailboxes while Karen spent community funds fighting a man she had no authority over? The audit was brutal. Receipts surfaced for catered parties labeled as community development meetings, landscaping invoices for her personal garden, and multiple charges to a retreat facility that just happened to be a winery she liked. The final blow came when someone uncovered a payment to a contractor listed under community improvement that was actually for the fence she tried to install across my driveway. That was enough. A recall vote was initiated, signatures flooded in, and within a week, Karen Montgomery was officially removed from her position as HOA president. Her resignation letter was 4 pages long, filled with passive-aggressive metaphors about ungrateful neighbors and men with tractors. It was poetic in the way falling off a Segway in slow motion is poetic. I didn't celebrate loudly. I didn't need to. My land was safe, my name cleared, and justice had done its quiet, meticulous work. But I'll admit, there was one thing I couldn't resist. I printed out the court ruling, laminated it, and nailed it to the fence post at the front of my property. Just below it, I added a small sign that read, "Karen's Law ends here." People passing by honked. Some stopped to take photos. Someone even dropped off a batch of brownies with a post-it that said, "Long live the McAllisters." Karen vanished for a while after that. Her house sat empty for weeks. Rumors flew, she'd moved to Florida, she was suing the HOA herself now, she'd started a podcast about community tyranny. I didn't really care. Because what mattered most was that this battle was over. Or so I thought. The strange quiet that followed Karen's removal was almost unnerving. For weeks, the neighborhood felt like it had collectively exhaled after holding its breath too long. Lawn signs vanished, clipboards disappeared, and not a single passive-aggressive newsletter arrived in anyone's mailbox. People started waving again, even making eye contact. It was like spring had arrived early, not in temperature but in spirit. Still, I knew better than to assume it was truly over. Karen might have lost her throne, but people like her rarely disappear. They just find new corners to sulk in and new angles to plot from. I focused on repairing what she'd tried to damage. The barn needed a new coat of paint after the unauthorized inspection crews had scuffed it up. The driveway needed to be smoothed where the half-built fence posts had left behind small divots. But beyond the physical cleanup, there was something more rewarding happening. My neighbors, some of whom had kept their distance for years, began dropping by. First it was Brenda, the former HOA secretary who brought over a tray of lemon bars and an apology. Then it was Carl, the guy who started the petition, asking if he could interview me for a community newsletter he wanted to start, one without hidden agendas or backdoor fines. Little by little, the community shifted. The board held an open forum to vote on whether the HOA should even continue existing. It was the first time I'd seen that clubhouse full for something other than mandatory compliance meetings. People came not out of fear, but curiosity and hope. I didn't speak at first. I let others tell their stories. The woman fined for her wind chimes, the single dad threatened over the color of his recycling bin, the older couple who were almost evicted because their ramp didn't meet aesthetic guidelines. When they asked my opinion, I said only this: when your rules do more harm than good, they aren't rules. They're weapons. The vote passed with overwhelming support to dissolve the HOA and replace it with a volunteer-led resident advisory group. No dues. No forced compliance. Just open conversation and shared decisions. I politely declined every nomination they threw at me. I didn't need the power. I just wanted my land, my peace, and a mailbox that didn't come with threats. Instead, I recommended Brenda, organized, fair, and far more patient than I'd ever be. The community approved it unanimously. Karen's house went up for sale not long after. I saw the "for sale" sign go up quietly one morning and, later that week, a moving truck pull in. I didn't see her, but I didn't need to. Her SUV was parked out front, packed to the brim, and someone had left a shattered garden gnome near the curb. Poetic. By the next morning, she was gone. Some said she moved to another HOA community in a different town. Others joked she was starting her own development called Karenville, where everyone had to wear pastels and sign NDAs. I didn't ask. I didn't care. But there was one last twist I hadn't seen coming. A week after she moved, I received a letter in a plain white envelope, hand-delivered with no return address. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. It read, "You may think you've won, Mr. McAllister, but some of us still believe in order. You were always too proud to be part of something greater. Enjoy your land. You'll be managing it alone soon enough." Creepy? A little. Vague? Definitely. Threatening? Maybe. But I'd dealt with Karen long enough to know one thing. She couldn't help but dramatize. It was her final curtain call, her last attempt to make herself feel important. I tossed the letter in the wood stove and watched it curl into smoke. A few months later, things felt different. Better. The new community group put together a neighborhood cleanup day, not because anyone was forced to, but because people actually wanted to help. Kids ran around freely again without being yelled at for chalk drawings on the sidewalk. Someone even organized a block party, and for the first time in years, people danced in the streets without fear of citations for excessive noise. And through it all, my land stayed exactly as it had always been, peaceful, untouched, and mine. To commemorate the chaos and the victory that followed, I did something small but symbolic. I took the old fence post where the fake permit had once been nailed and turned it into a signpost. I mounted a bronze plaque on it that read, "McAllister Homestead, founded 1862. Protected by history, humor, and one stubborn farmer." People chuckled when they passed by. Some took pictures. A few even asked if they could use it for a local heritage trail map they were building. I said sure, why not? It felt right. Not because I needed the attention, but because it reminded everyone what the town stood on. Not rules. Not regulations. But roots. On Founders' Day, the town held a small festival to celebrate its history. Normally a low-key affair, this year it got more attention than usual. A group of school kids read essays about the original settlers, including my great-great-grandfather. The local historian unveiled a restored version of the original township charter, complete with my ancestors' signature and the hand-drawn map that showed my property at its center. When they called me up to speak, I kept it simple. I didn't fight because I hate rules. I fought because not all rules are good. And not all leaders are right. But if you know where you come from, and you stand your ground, you won't be pushed by anyone who forgot how this town was built in the first place. The applause wasn't thunderous. It didn't need to be. It was warm, steady, and real. Later that evening, I sat on the porch swing, sipping sweet tea and watching the sun dip behind the barn. The land was quiet, peaceful, just as it should be. The chickens were clucking lazily in the coop, the wind rustled through the old oak trees, and the swing creaked in rhythm with my thoughts. For the first time in what felt like ages, I wasn't waiting for the next letter, the next confrontation, or the next attempt to push me off my own history. Karen had tried to turn a power trip into a legal crusade. She'd forgotten that sometimes the loudest voice in the room is just that, noise. And while she threw every trick in the book at me, from fake fines to full-blown court battles, she'd overlooked the one thing she couldn't fake: belonging. This land wasn't just where I lived. It was who I was, who my family had been for generations. And no matter how many forms she filled out, fences she built, or tantrums she threw, that was something she could never evict. And just like that, it was over. Not with a final confrontation or some dramatic explosion, but with silence, calm, and roots that ran far deeper than any paper ever could.